Robert had always been proud of his little house on Maple Street. After 30 years of working as a mechanic, he'd finally paid off the mortgage just before retiring. The white picket fence might have needed a fresh coat of paint, and maybe the garden wasn't as neat as his neighbors, but it was his home. At 67, he figured he'd earned the right to relax a little. The neighborhood had been quiet for years. Kids rode their bikes down the street. Neighbors waved from their porches, and the biggest drama was usually about whose turn it was to organize the annual block party. Robert liked it that way. He'd raised his son here, watched him grow up playing baseball in the backyard and learning to drive in the empty parking lot down the street. Everything started changing about 6 months ago when new people moved into the big house at the end of the block. They seemed nice enough at first, always dressed in business clothes and driving expensive cars. But then the letters started coming. The first letter showed up on a Tuesday morning tucked under his windshield wiper. Robert almost threw it away, thinking it was just another flyer for lawn service or pizza delivery. But something about the official-looking letterhead made him take a second look. It was from something called the Maple Street Community Standards Board, and it was addressed to him personally. The letter was full of big words and legal-sounding language that made Robert's head spin. It talked about property maintenance violations and community standards compliance. According to the letter, his mailbox was the wrong color. His garden gnome was considered inappropriate decorative elements, and his fence needed immediate repairs. The letter demanded he fix these issues within 10 days or face fines starting at $200. Robert scratched his head as he read it. His mailbox was the same blue it had been for 15 years. The garden gnome was a gift from his granddaughter last Christmas. And sure, his fence had a loose board or two, but it wasn't falling down or anything. He'd never heard of any community standards board, and nobody had ever complained about his property before. He called his neighbor Betty, who lived next door and had been in the neighborhood even longer than he had. She was just as confused as he was. "I've never heard of any community standards board," she said. "Are you sure it's not just some scam? You know how these things go these days." Robert wasn't sure what to think. The letter looked official enough, with fancy letterhead and everything. But something about it didn't feel right. He decided to ignore it and see what happened. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was even more aggressive. It claimed he had failed to respond to the first notice and now owed $400 in fines. It also added new violations he'd never heard of before. Apparently, the chalk drawings his grandkids had made on the sidewalk during their last visit were considered unauthorized property. Markings. The small American flag he'd put up for Memorial Day was improperly displayed according to community guidelines. This time, Robert was getting angry. He'd served his country, paid his taxes, and been a good neighbor for decades. Who were these people to tell him he couldn't have chalk drawings on his own sidewalk or fly the American flag? He tried calling the phone number on the letter, but it just went to a voicemail that said the mailbox was full. The address listed was just a P.O. box. Robert started to think Betty might be right about this being some kind of scam. The third letter came just a week later, and this one made Robert's hands shake as he read it. The fine had jumped to $800, and the letter threatened immediate legal action if he didn't pay within 48 hours. It mentioned something about liens on his property and possible foreclosure proceedings. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about all the stories he'd heard on the news about people losing their homes over unpaid fees and legal troubles they didn't understand. He'd worked too hard for too long to lose everything now over some stupid community standards he'd never agreed to follow. He tried calling his son, but got voicemail. His boy was probably busy with work. Robert didn't want to bother him anyway. His son had his own life to worry about, and Robert had always prided himself on handling his own problems. The next morning brought another letter, even more threatening than the last. This one mentioned enforcement personnel and property inspection teams. The language was so intimidating that Robert felt his chest tighten as he read it. The fine was now up to $1,200, and they were demanding immediate payment, or they would begin collection procedures. Robert spent the day pacing around his house, looking at everything through new eyes. Was his mailbox really the wrong color? Did his garden gnome look inappropriate? He'd never thought about these things before, but now every little imperfection seemed to jump out at him. That evening he called Betty again. She came over and read the letters herself, shaking her head the whole time. "Robert, this is definitely a scam," she said firmly. "I've lived here for 40 years and there's never been any community standards board. And look at this language. It's designed to scare you into paying money you don't owe." But even with Betty's reassurance, Robert couldn't shake the worry. What if she was wrong? What if this was real and he really could lose his house? He'd heard stories about homeowner associations having a lot of power, and he wasn't sure what rights he had. He decided to do some research at the library the next day. But before he could make it there, everything would change in a way he never could have expected. The fourth letter arrived on Friday morning, and this one was different. Instead of threats about fines and legal action, it announced that enforcement representatives would be coming to his property on Monday afternoon for a final compliance inspection. The letter said that if the violations weren't corrected by then, they would begin immediate collection proceedings. Robert's hands were shaking as he read it. Monday was only 3 days away, and he still didn't know if this was real or fake. The uncertainty was eating him alive, and he felt more alone and confused than he had since his wife passed away 5 years ago. What Robert didn't know was that Monday would bring visitors to his door who had no idea what they were walking into. And the surprise waiting for them would change everything. Monday morning came too soon for Robert. He'd barely slept all weekend, tossing and turning as he worried about what the day might bring. He kept looking out his front window, checking for any signs of the enforcement representatives the letter had mentioned. Part of him hoped they wouldn't show up at all, that this whole thing would just go away. Around 10 in the morning, his phone rang. It was his son calling from the naval base where he worked as an instructor. "Hey, Dad, I've got some leave coming up and thought I might drive down to visit for a few days. Would that be okay?" Robert felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Of course, son. You know you're always welcome here. When were you thinking of coming?" "Actually, I'm already on the road. Should be there around lunchtime if that works for you." For the first time in weeks, Robert smiled. Having his son around always made everything seem more manageable. His boy had always been good at figuring out problems and seeing solutions that Robert might miss. Maybe he could help make sense of these crazy letters. Robert's son Danny had joined the Navy right out of high school and made it his career. He'd worked his way up through the ranks and now spent his time training younger sailors in combat techniques and survival skills. At 35, he was still in excellent shape and had a way of staying calm under pressure that Robert had always admired. When Danny arrived just after noon, Robert was waiting on the front porch. His son looked good, healthy and strong as always. They hugged, and Robert immediately felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. There was something reassuring about having his boy home, even if it was just for a visit. "The place looks good, Dad," Danny said, grabbing his duffel bag from the truck. "You've been keeping up with everything okay?" Robert hesitated. He'd been planning to tell Danny about the letters right away, but now that his son was here, he felt a little embarrassed about the whole situation. What if Danny thought he was being foolish for worrying about what might just be a scam? "Yeah, everything's fine," Robert said. "Just the usual stuff, you know. Come on in, I'll make us some lunch." They spent the next hour catching up over sandwiches and coffee. Danny told stories about the young sailors he was training, and Robert shared neighborhood news and updates about his garden. For a while, Robert almost forgot about the letters sitting in the kitchen drawer, but at 2:30, everything changed. The sound started as a rumble in the distance, getting louder as it approached. Robert looked out the front window and saw a large black SUV with tinted windows pulling up to the curb in front of his house. His stomach dropped as two men got out of the vehicle. The first man was tall and thick-set, wearing what looked like a security guard uniform with patches and badges. He carried a clipboard and had an official-looking camera hanging around his neck. The second man was smaller but moved with an aggressive swagger, wearing a polo shirt with some kind of logo on it. "Dad, you expecting someone?" Danny asked, noticing Robert's expression. Before Robert could answer, both men were marching up the front walkway with purpose. The bigger man was already shouting before he even reached the porch. "Robert Peterson, this is your final notice. You have outstanding violations that must be addressed immediately." Robert's hands started shaking. This was really happening. The enforcement representatives had actually come, just like the letter said they would. Danny noticed his father's reaction and stood up from the kitchen table. "Who are these people, Dad?" The pounding on the front door was loud and aggressive. "Mr. Peterson." Open this door immediately. We are here on official business regarding your property violations. Robert felt frozen. He wanted to hide, to pretend he wasn't home, but his truck was sitting right in the driveway. There was no way to avoid this confrontation. "Dad, what's going on?" Danny's voice was calm but firm. He could see that his father was genuinely scared of whoever was at the door. "I've been getting these letters," Robert said quickly, his words tumbling out, "about violations and fines and community standards. I didn't know if they were real or fake, but now they're here and I don't know what to do." The pounding on the door got louder. "Mr. Peterson, we know you're in there. If you don't open this door, we'll be forced to escalate this matter to the authorities." Danny's expression changed. Years of military training had taught him to recognize intimidation tactics, and everything about this situation was setting off alarm bells in his head. The aggressive approach, the threatening language, the attempt to create urgency and fear, these were classic signs of people trying to scam vulnerable targets. "Dad, stay here for a minute," Danny said. "Let me handle this. But what if they're legitimate? What if I really do owe money and they can take the house?" Danny put a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "Trust me, Dad. If these were legitimate officials, they wouldn't be acting like this. Real enforcement officers follow procedures and show proper identification. These guys are trying to scare you." The shouting outside continued. "This is your last warning, Mr. Peterson. We have authority to place liens on this property. You need to pay the outstanding fines immediately or face serious consequences." Danny walked calmly to the front door. Through the window, he could see both men on the porch. The bigger one was still pounding on the door, while the smaller one was taking pictures of the house with his camera. Their body language was aggressive and impatient, not at all like professional enforcement officers. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Danny called through the door, his voice steady and authoritative. The pounding stopped. There was a moment of silence, then the bigger man spoke again, though his tone was slightly less aggressive than before. "We're here to speak with Robert Peterson about outstanding community standards violations." "Are you Mr. Peterson?" "No, I'm his son." "What agency are you with?" Another pause. Danny could hear the two men talking quietly to each other, though he couldn't make out the words. When the bigger man spoke again, he sounded less certain than before. "We're with the Maple Street Community Standards Board. Your father has multiple violations that require immediate attention and payment of accumulated fines." Danny smiled grimly, just as he'd suspected. "I see. And you have identification showing your authority to collect these fines?" The conversation outside became more animated. Danny could tell the two men were arguing about something. Finally, the smaller man spoke up. "Look, we don't have time for games. Your father owes $1,200 in fines, and if he doesn't pay today, we're authorized to begin collection procedures. This is a serious legal matter." "I understand," Danny said calmly. "But before we discuss any payments, I'll need to see proper identification and documentation of your authority to collect these fines. That's standard procedure for any legitimate enforcement action." There was a longer pause this time. Danny could hear the men moving around on the porch, and their voices were getting more agitated. He recognized the signs of people whose story was starting to fall apart under questioning. What happened next would expose the truth about who these men really were and what they were really after. But it would also show them that they had picked the wrong house and the wrong family to try to intimidate. The silence outside stretched on for what felt like forever. Danny could hear the two men whispering urgently to each other, and he knew they were trying to figure out how to respond to his request for identification. In his experience, legitimate officials never hesitated to show their credentials when asked. Finally, the bigger man cleared his throat. "Our identification is in the vehicle. But this is really a simple matter. Your father just needs to pay the outstanding fines and we can resolve this today." Danny almost laughed. These guys were making it too easy. "I'll wait while you get your identification," he said. "Take your time," more urgent whispering. Then the smaller man tried a different approach. "Look, we're trying to help your father here. These fines are just going to keep growing if we don't handle this today. We can work out a payment plan, maybe reduce the total amount owed." Now Danny was certain these were scammers. Legitimate enforcement officers didn't negotiate fines on the spot or offer payment plans at the door. They followed legal procedures and paperwork requirements. These men were clearly making things up as they went along. "I appreciate that," Danny said, keeping his voice friendly but firm. "But I'm sure you understand that before my father pays anything, We need to verify that you have legal authority to collect these fines. So let's start with that identification. Robert had been listening from the kitchen, and Danny could hear his father moving around nervously. The poor man had been terrorized by these letters for weeks, not knowing if they were real or fake. Now he was probably worried that Danny's questions were just making things worse. "Dad, it's okay," Danny called back to his father. "These gentlemen are going to show us their identification so we can verify everything is legitimate." The men outside were getting more agitated. Danny could hear footsteps moving around on the porch, and their voices were getting louder, even though they were trying to whisper. "This is ridiculous," the bigger man finally said. "We don't have time for these games. Your father is in serious legal trouble here. If he doesn't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this to the county sheriff's office." Danny had heard enough. The mention of escalating to law enforcement was a classic intimidation tactic used by scammers. They were trying to scare his father into paying money he didn't owe by threatening to involve real authorities who would quickly expose them as frauds. "Actually, that's a great idea," Danny said. "Why don't we call the sheriff's office right now and have them verify your authority? I'm sure they'd be happy to confirm that you're legitimate enforcement officers." The reaction was immediate. The whispering outside became urgent and heated. Danny could tell the two men were starting to panic. They had probably been counting on intimidating an elderly man living alone, not dealing with someone who knew how to ask the right questions. "That won't be necessary," the smaller man said quickly. "We can handle this matter ourselves. But your father needs to understand that his failure to pay these fines is a serious matter that could result in legal action against his property." Danny decided it was time to open the door. He wanted to get a good look at these two and maybe take some pictures of their vehicle and license plate. In his experience, scammers usually ran when they realized their target wasn't going to be easily intimidated. He unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The two men immediately stepped back, clearly not expecting someone of Danny's size and bearing to emerge from the house. Danny was tall and muscular, with the confident posture of someone who was used to being in charge of difficult situations. "Gentlemen," Danny said politely, "I'm going to need to see some identification before we go any further." The bigger man was holding his clipboard like a shield, and Danny could see that his hands were shaking slightly. The smaller man had moved closer to the steps, as if preparing to make a quick exit. "Like I said, our identification is in the vehicle," the bigger man repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's fine," Danny said. "I'll wait here while you get it." He crossed his arms and settled into a comfortable stance that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. The two men looked at each other, and Danny could see the moment when they realized their scam wasn't going to work. The smaller man started moving toward the steps. "Actually, we need to get back to the office and check on some paperwork," he said quickly. "We'll have to reschedule this visit." "Wait a minute," Danny said, pulling out his phone. "Before you go, let me get a picture of your identification badges for our records. That's standard procedure when enforcement officers visit private property." Both men immediately turned away and started moving quickly toward their vehicle. "That won't be necessary," the bigger man called over his shoulder. "We'll be in touch." Danny followed them down the walkway, still holding his phone. "What agency did you say you were with again? I want to make sure my father contacts the right office to resolve this matter." But the men were already at their SUV, climbing in as fast as they could. The bigger man was struggling to get his clipboard and camera into the vehicle, while the smaller man was already starting the engine. "I'm going to need that license plate number," Danny called out, making sure they could hear him as he took several pictures of their vehicle. The SUV pulled away from the curb with a screech of tires, leaving Danny standing in his father's front yard with clear photos of their license plate and a perfect view of their panicked retreat. Robert appeared in the doorway, looking confused and relieved at the same time. "What just happened? Are they coming back?" Danny walked back up to the porch, shaking his head and smiling. "No, Dad, they're not coming back. Those guys were running a scam just like your neighbor thought, but they seemed so official. They had uniforms and badges and everything. Anyone can buy official-looking clothes and fake badges online," Danny explained. "The real test is whether they can provide legitimate identification and follow proper legal procedures. These guys couldn't do either." Robert sank into one of the porch chairs, looking like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "So I don't owe any money? They can't take my house?" "No, Dad, you don't owe anything, and they can't take your house. But we need to report this to the real authorities so they can investigate and make sure these guys don't target other people in the neighborhood." As Danny helped his father understand what had just happened, he was already planning the next steps. He had photos of the scammers and their vehicle, and he knew exactly who to call to make sure they face consequences for targeting vulnerable seniors. But first, he wanted to find out how widespread the scam was, and whether other people in the neighborhood had been targeted. What he would discover would surprise both him and his father, and lead to actions that would protect the entire community from these predators. After the scammers drove away, Danny helped his father inside and made him a cup of coffee. Robert was still shaking a little, partly from relief and partly from anger at being fooled by the fake letters. "I can't believe I fell for that," Robert said, slumping into his kitchen chair. "I should have known it was fake from the beginning." "Don't blame yourself, Dad," Danny said firmly. "These guys are professionals. They know exactly how to make their scam look legitimate, and they specifically target people who are likely to be intimidated by official-looking letters and threats." Danny picked up the stack of letters Robert had received and read through them carefully. The more he studied them, the angrier he became. Everything about the letters was designed to create fear and confusion. The language was deliberately complex and threatening. The fines escalated quickly to create urgency, and the contact information was designed to avoid any real verification. "Dad, I need to ask you something important," Danny said. "Have you paid them any money at all?" "No, thank goodness. I kept meaning to, but something always held me back. I guess I was lucky," Danny felt relieved. Once scammers got even a small payment from a victim, they usually became much more aggressive and persistent. The fact that Robert hadn't paid anything meant the scammers would probably move on to easier targets now that their cover was blown. "We need to call the police and report this," Danny said. "But first I want to talk to some of your neighbors and see if anyone else has been getting these letters." They started with Betty next door. When she answered her door and saw the stack of letters in Danny's hand, her face immediately showed recognition. "Oh my goodness, you got them too," she said. "I was wondering if I should have taken them more seriously." "You got letters too?" Robert asked, surprised. Betty nodded and invited them inside. She went to her kitchen and came back with a smaller stack of similar letters. "I only got 3 of them, but they were just as threatening as yours. I figured they were fake because I've never heard of any community standards board." Danny examined Betty's letters. They were nearly identical to his father's, but with different violation claims. According to her letters, Betty's flower boxes were improperly maintained. Her outdoor Christmas decorations were seasonal violations, and her newspaper delivery was creating unsightly property conditions. "This is clearly a pattern," Danny said. "They're targeting multiple houses in the neighborhood. Have you seen anyone else talking about getting letters like this?" Betty thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. I was talking to Mrs. Chen down the street last week, and she mentioned getting some kind of official letters about her property. She seemed really worried about them." Danny felt his jaw tighten. These scammers were systematically targeting elderly residents throughout the neighborhood, probably hoping that at least some of them would pay the fake fines out of fear or confusion. "We need to go talk to Mrs. Chen," he said, "and then we need to knock on every door on this street to find out how many people have been targeted." Over the next 2 hours, Danny and Robert discovered that the scam was even more widespread than they had imagined. Mrs. Chen had received 5 letters and was so scared that she had actually called a lawyer about possibly losing her house. Mr. Williams, 3 houses down, had gotten 4 letters and was planning to pay the fines the next day. The elderly couple at the end of the block had received letters but thrown them away, thinking they were junk mail. In total, they found 8 households that had been targeted. The scammers had been systematic in their approach, focusing on houses that appeared to have elderly residents living alone or in couples. They had avoided houses with obvious signs of younger families, like children's toys in the yards or multiple cars in the driveways. "This makes me so angry," Robert said as they walked back to his house after talking to all the neighbors. "These people are targeting the most vulnerable people in our community." Danny was angry too, but he was also thinking strategically. "Dad, I want to call the police now, but I also want to do something else. I think we should contact the local news station and let them know about this scam." "The news? Why?" "Because there are probably other neighborhoods being targeted too. If we can get this story on the news, it might help protect other people from falling for the same scam. Plus, it might help the police track down these guys if other victims come forward." They called the police first. The officer who took the report was very interested in Danny's photos of the scammers and their license plate. He told them that they had received a few other reports of similar scams in surrounding neighborhoods, but this was the first time anyone had managed to get clear photos of the perpetrators. These guys have been pretty careful to avoid being identified, the officer explained. They usually target people who are less likely to think of taking pictures or asking the right questions. Your military training probably saved not just your father, but a lot of other potential victims too. Next, Danny called the local news station. The reporter he spoke with was immediately interested in the story. Scams targeting elderly residents were always news, and the fact that they had photos and multiple victims made it an even stronger story. "We'd like to do an interview with you and your father," the reporter said, "and maybe talk to some of the other neighbors who were targeted. Can we set something up for tomorrow morning?" Danny looked at his father, who nodded. "I think people need to know about this," Robert said. "If our story can help protect other families, then we should tell it." That evening, Danny helped his father organize all the fake letters and prepare for the interview. They also called all the neighbors who had been targeted to let them know about the news story and give them the option to participate if they wanted to. "You know what bothers me the most about this?" Robert said as they sat on the front porch that evening. "It's not just the money they were trying to steal. It's how they made me feel. For weeks, I felt like I was doing something wrong, like I wasn't taking care of my property properly. They made me doubt myself and worry about losing the home I've worked my whole life for." Danny understood exactly what his father meant. The psychological impact of these scams often went far beyond the financial damage. The scammers had deliberately created fear, confusion, and self-doubt in their victims. They had made elderly people feel vulnerable and powerless in their own homes. "The good news is that we're going to make sure they face consequences for what they did," Danny said. "And hopefully our story will help other people recognize these scams before they become victims." As they sat there talking, Danny noticed a car driving slowly down the street. It wasn't the same SUV from earlier, but something about it made him pay attention. The car paused in front of several houses as if the driver was looking at specific addresses. "Dad, do you recognize that car?" Danny asked quietly. Robert looked where his son was pointing and shook his head. "Never seen it before, why?" Danny was already standing up and taking out his phone. "Because I think our friends might be back to check on their other targets. And if they are, I want to make sure we get pictures of them too." What Danny didn't know was that the people in that car were about to make a mistake that would give the police everything they needed to shut down the entire scam operation. And the confrontation that was about to happen would ensure that these scammers never targeted another vulnerable senior citizen again. The car continued its slow cruise down Maple Street, and Danny could see that whoever was inside was definitely checking out specific houses. When it stopped in front of Mrs. Chen's house, Danny knew his suspicions were correct. "Dad, call the police and tell them the scammers might be back," Danny said quietly. "I'm going to get closer and see what they're doing." Robert hurried inside to make the call while Danny walked casually across the street, trying to look like he was just out for an evening stroll. As he got closer to Mrs. Chen's house, he could see two people in the car, a woman driving and a man in the passenger seat. They were both looking at a clipboard and seemed to be checking addresses against a list. The man in the passenger seat got out and walked up to Mrs. Chen's mailbox. Danny could see him placing something inside it, probably another threatening letter. This was exactly what Danny had hoped would happen. Now they had evidence of the scammers actually delivering their fake letters. Danny took several photos with his phone, making sure to get clear shots of the man's face and the car's license plate. When the man turned around and saw Danny watching him, their eyes met for a moment. Danny gave him a friendly wave as if he was just a neighbor saying hello. The man quickly got back in the car, and Danny could see him talking urgently to the woman driving. They drove away quickly, but not before Danny got several more photos of the vehicle and its occupants. By the time Danny got back to his father's house, Robert was just hanging up the phone with the police. "They're sending a patrol car right away," Robert said. "Did you see what they were doing?" "They put something in Mrs. Chen's mailbox," Danny replied. "Probably another fake letter, and I got plenty of photos of them doing it." Within 10 minutes, a police car pulled up in front of the house. The same officer who had taken their report earlier got out and walked up to the porch. "You called about seeing the suspects again?" Officer Johnson asked. Danny showed him the photos he had just taken. They were delivering letters to houses on this street. "I watched one of them put something in Mrs. Chen's mailbox." Officer Johnson studied the photos carefully. This is excellent evidence. With these photos and the ones you took earlier, we should be able to identify these people and track down their operation. They walked down to Mrs. Chen's house together. Sure enough, there was a new letter in her mailbox, identical in style to all the others they had seen. This letter claimed that Mrs. Chen had failed to respond to previous notices and now owed $1,500 in fines. The escalation pattern is exactly the same, Danny pointed out. They're using the same playbook on every victim. Officer Johnson bagged the letter as evidence. We're going to run the license plates from your photos and see if we can track these people down. In the meantime, I want to make sure all the neighbors know not to pay any money if they receive more letters. The next morning, the local news crew arrived at Robert's house. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh, was a veteran journalist who had covered many scam stories over the years. She was particularly interested in the systematic way the scammers had targeted elderly residents. "What made you suspicious when the men came to your door?" she asked Danny during the interview. "Everything about their approach was wrong," Danny explained. "Legitimate enforcement officers identify themselves properly, follow legal procedures, and don't try to intimidate people into paying money on the spot. These guys were clearly trying to scare my father into paying money he didn't owe." Robert also spoke during the interview, sharing how the letters had made him feel and encouraging other seniors to ask questions if they received similar correspondence. "Don't be embarrassed to call someone for help," Robert said to the camera. "These scammers count on people being too proud or too scared to ask questions. But there's no shame in getting a second opinion when something doesn't feel right." Mrs. Chen and several other neighbors also participated in the interview, showing their fake letters and describing how the scam had affected them. The story painted a clear picture of an organized effort to defraud elderly residents throughout the community. 2 days after the news story aired, Officer Johnson called with an update. "We got them," he said with satisfaction in his voice. "The license plates led us to a rental car, and the rental records gave us names and addresses. We arrested 4 people this morning who were running this scam across 3 different counties. The investigation revealed that the scam operation was even larger than anyone had imagined. The group had targeted more than 50 neighborhoods over the past 6 months, sending thousands of fake letters and collecting tens of thousands of dollars from victims who paid the fraudulent fines. Your photos were crucial evidence," Officer Johnson explained. "Without them, we might never have been able to identify and locate these people. And your father's decision to go public with the story led to dozens of other victims coming forward. The news story had indeed prompted many other people to contact the police. Victims from surrounding communities had seen the report and realized they had been targeted by the same scam. Several people had already paid money to the fake enforcement officers, and the police were working to help them recover their losses. 3 weeks later, Danny had to return to his base, but he left feeling confident that his father and the neighborhood were safe. The scammers were in jail awaiting trial, and the community was much more aware of how to recognize and respond to similar scams in the future. Robert kept in touch with all his neighbors who had been targeted, and they formed an informal network to watch out for each other. When Mrs. Williams received a suspicious letter about supposed code violations 2 months later, she immediately called Robert, who helped her verify that it was another scam attempt. "I feel like I learned something important from all this," Robert told his son during one of their regular phone calls. "I learned that it's okay to ask for help when something doesn't feel right. And I learned that standing up to bullies, even professional ones, is always the right thing to do." The story had a lasting impact on the entire community. The local police department used it as a training example for other officers, and several neighborhood watch groups invited Danny to speak about recognizing scam tactics when he was home on leave. But perhaps the most important outcome was that Robert never again felt helpless when faced with intimidation or threats. He had learned that asking the right questions and getting proper verification could protect not just himself, but his entire community. The fake HOA patrol had thought they were targeting an easy victim living alone. Instead, they had run into a family that knew how to fight back, and their mistake had ended up protecting dozens of other potential victims from falling for the same scam. Years later, Robert would still smile when he remembered the look on those scammers' faces when they realized they had picked the wrong house to target. Sometimes the best defense against predators is simply refusing to be intimidated and knowing when to ask for help.